Welcome to After Party, everyone. If you are a little sleepy, maybe you're nodding off, that theme song will always get you right back in the mood for some news, some partying, maybe a little bit of both. We got a big show today. The great Glenn Greenwald is here. He's going to join us in just a moment. I also had the chance to sit down with FCC Commissioner Brendan Carr earlier today for a long-form discussion of a lot, basically to talk about a lot of the speculation that's been swirling around Chairman Carr and the Paramount Skydance merger. We've covered Colbert and The Late Show extensively here. We show him a clip, actually, of South Park, get his reaction to that, and much more. It's a pretty newsy conversation with Chairman Carr, so I would encourage you to stick around. Now, we do have some business to get to at the top of the show, first of all, and I would say most importantly, like I just mentioned, we have a big show today, but the most important thing to start with, I think, is that we love Democratic Minority Leader in the House, Representative Hakeem Jeffries, on this show. We've often referred to him as the Democratic mascot, the unofficial mascot of After Party, the fearless leader of the House Democrats. It's actually his birthday today. He posted this on Instagram and just said straight up, double nickels. There he is in Midtown Manhattan enjoying the day. I'm kidding. That's clearly California, I think. But just wanted to wish Hakeem Jeffries a happy birthday. We love him here on After Party, his fearlessness, his brave stance, and I think above all else, his social media acumen, his ability to relate to younger Democrats, younger Democratic men. So happy birthday, Hakeem Jeffries. Now, on another note, more big news and more important topics for us to cover just very briefly. In case you're unaware, After Party actually caused a little bit of an international incident after Wednesday's show, actually after Monday's show, when Adam Carolla joined us. He spilled a little bit of tea about one time he was backstage with Ellen DeGeneres. And this was so juicy, in fact, that the Daily Mail covered it. Many international outlets covered it. Entertainment Weekly, all of these publications that I read fairly religiously covered it. And it looks like the Daily Mail actually sent up paparazzi to get pictures of Ellen as she reeled from this news that Adam Carolla broke here on After Party about Ellen DeGeneres' staff seeming fairly afraid of her. This is a quote from the Daily Mail article. The couple affectionately held hands after the comedian and podcaster Adam Carolla alleged that DeGeneres' talk show staff were, quote, scared real squared on the two occasions that he was a guest on her show. So the couple affectionately held hands. Good to know. And thanks, as always, to the Daily Mail for keeping track of this. Now, just one more thing on this note. The saga deepened when Rob Shooter of the Shooter Scoop actually confirmed with his source, his sources in Ellen World, quote, a source alleged that the former host of the Ellen DeGeneres show was shocked, quote, shocked by the explosive new revelations. Moreover, DeGeneres, quote, had no idea the crew felt that way. This is the kind of breaking news that you tune in live Mondays and Wednesdays at 10 p.m. for here on After Party. Cutting edge, fearless, international, CFI. That's what I want you to think of when you think of After Party. CFI, cutting edge, fearless, international. That is what we do. That is who we are. And actually, on that note, I think it's appropriate to bring in our wonderful guest, Glenn Greenwald, cutting edge, fearless, international. Glenn, you are all of these things.
I am all these things. I'm so happy to be at your party. I've seen all these people being invited before me. And I was like, when am I going to be invited to this party? And finally, I got my invitation. I was so happy, though. I wish you had told me it was Hakeem Jeffries' birthday and I brought some cake with like the double nickels. He's so cool the way he says that, the double nickels, to celebrate. But no one told me. But I think we can have a metaphorical cake.
I'm going to have to pull an Ellen with the After Party staff and actually get on them for not mentioning to you when you were coming on today on all days. It's Hakeem Jeffries. So I know you like to celebrate privately, but we're here. So we both wish Hakeem Jeffries a very happy birthday. Now,
we do.
Glenn,
we do.
Glenn is, of course, the host of System Update, which I love. Fantastic show. And Glenn, I want to get your reaction to something that you've been covering literally for years. This is F4. This is a Fox News headline from today. Attorney General Pam Bondi, the story reads, directed her staff Monday to act on the criminal referral from DNI Gabbard related to the alleged conspiracy to tie Trump to Russia. And the DOJ is now opening a grand jury investigation into the matter. So, Glenn, it is my understanding that you are one of the great legal minds of your generation. You are a trained attorney. So what does it mean? What is the significance of the grand jury escalation that we learned about today?
Well, I'm of two minds about it. Number one is I have seen the Trump Justice Department announcing what is pretty meaningless often, and you don't usually announce it for that reason, which is we're investigating so-and-so, and it's usually like red meat fed to
I don't know what you're talking
base.
about. I don't know what you're talking about.
And you never hear about it again. It's like, yeah, they're investigating, John Brennan. And then it's like nothing ever comes of it because that's such a meaningless designation. On the other hand, if they're really impaneling a grand jury investigation, that is not something that is done lightly. That is something that requires court approval. You need to get citizens who take off from their job, who stay there for a long time, who accompany this investigation. It's a lot of DOJ resources. And, I do think there's some stuff in this new set of disclosures that contributes to the belief that there was criminality here, not just political abuses of the intelligence agency or deliberate dissemination of fabrications. That they did for sure. But whether it rises to the intent of a criminal mind, of criminal intent that you would need even to impanel a grand jury investigation, let alone indict somebody, I think there's a slightly stronger case for it now with these new disclosures.
Okay, interesting. So one of the big questions then is, does this imperil legally Hillary Clinton or former President Barack Obama? Those are the two obvious names. I mean, I think it's pretty clear at this point that John Brennan could be in trouble, James Clapper could be in trouble. But when we're talking about former president, former presidential nominee, what do we know actually as you see it right now? That still feels very far-fetched to me, especially with the presidential immunity decision in the Obama case. But legally, is there much that can be done by the Trump administration at this point?
Yeah, if you read the Supreme Court's immunity decision, that, of course, redounded massively to the favor of Trump. And I was trying to tell everybody at the time, it's not just for Trump. It also immunizes past presidents and future ones. So if you do want to investigate and imprison Joe Biden or Barack Obama, this is going to completely shield them as well. Basically, it just says that any exercise of legitimate Article 2 power, even if it's done corruptly and criminally, it's still immunized. Just anything you're doing under Article 2 and obviously overseeing an intelligence investigation, even if done with corrupt motives, is clearly within the Article 2 power. So there's no way you could indict President Obama, given that immunity ruling. The other problem with Hillary Clinton is that a lot of these acts are 8 years old now, and many of them are outside of the statute of limitations. One of the reasons why people think you could still prosecute Brennan and Clapper and even Comey is because they actually testified much more recently and made some statements that are quite clearly false. The way the New York Times describes it is these newest disclosures complicate Brennan's narrative. That's just such a nice way to have your lies described by the New York Times. It complicates the narrative. And another article called it, these are some messy disclosures. But they definitely lied about what Russiagate was, to what extent they relied on the Steele dossier, what kind of intelligence they had that justified these conclusions, whether they were alleging merely Russian involvement or actually collusion. And of course, the collusion was what drove the whole scandal in the first place. There would never have been a scandal without the collusion aspect. Still, having a former CIA director or FBI director indicted, criminally charged, and put into criminal court is something we do not see in this country. So I'll believe it only when I see it. But I do think there are probably people inside the Trump administration, given that they did try to actually imprison Donald Trump, had he not won this election, he would be imprisoned for life. I'm sure starting with Trump and moving down, they want some, I guess you could call it equal application of the law or vengeance or some combination thereof, and want to see some of the people who tried to imprison Donald Trump themselves imprisoned.
It's so strange to be in this banana republic territory where you look at what happened to Donald Trump, and whether you supported Trump or not, there were people, I think, that were sober minds saying this is setting a dangerous precedent. And then you look at the Trump administration coming in and, in some ways pursuing, I think, what's legitimate justice, and then in other ways pursuing very divisive justice. And, there's still an open debate to be had, given where the evidence goes, about whether this is a legitimate pursuit of justice or not when it comes to like Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama, who clearly acted badly, but whether or not there's a legal rationale, I think is yet to be determined. And then you have Trump going after like Ramesa Ozturk and some of the excessive use of power that's come from law enforcement under the directive of the President of the United States. Like, I know this is a much bigger picture question than Russiagate, but to me it all sort of, as somebody who's been opposed to Russiagate from basically the beginning, you want to see justice, you want to see clarity, you want to see disclosure, but then you just get that pit in your stomach about where it goes. And I don't know if I'm alone in that, or maybe it's just the red wine, which it occurs to me I'm drinking in a white shirt. So give me your thoughts, Glenn.
Yeah, that can create unwarranted anxiety, I hear. No, so, I'm of two minds about this, because I remember in 2007, 2008, which is like the first few years of my writing about politics, I was very focused on the war on terror, the crimes of the Bush and Cheney administration. And I absolutely believe that some of those policies were outright criminal. They ordered the NSA to spy on American citizens without the warrants required by law. They just ignored the law, created a theory that they had the power to do that. Obviously, torture, people have been prosecuted for torture under domestic law, as well as international law, and it went way beyond just 3 cases of waterboarding. There were, all kinds of sleep deprivation and stress positions, things that humanitarian law blatantly prohibits. And when Obama was running in 2008, a lot of liberals, a lot of people in his party were asking him, would you, if you're elected, consider having the Justice Department prosecute the people who committed these crimes? And he kept saying, absolutely, nobody's above the law, but I would ask my attorney general to see if there are crimes, and if there are crimes, we would prosecute. He wins. 2 months in office, he announces nobody's being prosecuted. His argument was we have to look forward, not backward, which justifies never prosecuting any crime. I mean, all crimes by definition require looking backward. They're in the past, so you have to look backward. And that idea, oh, we have so many important things we can't look backward, would, you should free everybody from prison then and never have any more criminal trials. And I remember at the time the overwhelming view of the corporate media was, yes, this is the right decision. Only banana republics prosecute prior presidents, have administrations prosecute prior presidents. And I understand that. I understand the obvious potential for abuse in Brazil, for example. Just today, this very authoritarian judge ordered Jair Bolsonaro put under house arrest because he participated in a protest against this judge. And the prior president, also the current president, Lula da Silva, was also imprisoned on charges that ended up being fabricated. So this kind of retribution of putting people in prison that are political enemies can be a sort of characteristic of Banana Republic. But I also think a Banana Republic is a place where political elites are immunized even if they break the law. So the idea that, well, because it creates a little bit of danger or potential for retribution, that someone like John Brennan or James Clapper or even Hillary Clinton should be able to break the law, and we're just going to say they're immunized, it's too turbulent to hold them accountable. That was the Gerald Ford argument for not prosecuting Richard Nixon, but instead pardoning him, which was like, we have to move forward. So you create this kind of immunity that all political elites know they enjoy, and they can violate the law with impunity. And that also is a kind of Banana Republic. But like I said, threatening with Trump with prosecution in 4 separate jurisdictions, 2 state and 2 federal, and on all 4, in my view, were frivolous grounds.
RICO.
It was I mean, and like, a president has classified documents. A president is the only arbiter on what's classified or not. He could have just said, I hereby magically disclassified them, and they would have all been declassified. And the idea that a president, of all people, can't have classified material. Oh, and then, of course, the Manhattan case, which, was about a bookkeeping error, basically, that never would have been a felony, but a misdemeanor had it been anyone under Trump. That was vindictive. That was lawfare. That was an abuse of the political process against political enemies. And so I do think part of the motive of Trump and Trump officials is, like I said, a little bit of vengeance. But I also think that if there are crimes here and the grand jury finds them, and I'm not closed at all to the fact that there were, then why shouldn't those people be punished the way every other ordinary citizen is?
Right. No, that's a great point. And actually, going back, you were just reflecting on some of your earlier reporting. You were all over this story in 2016, and you posted this as the last time you were on MSNBC. Actually, it was 2016.
December.
And this is incredible. This clip is incredible, museum-worthy stuff, and we have it here. So I'm going to play it and then get your reaction on the other side, Glenn. This is S3.
But there is still, Glenn, of course, a spectrum that investigators, lawyers, and intelligence officials all use. And on that spectrum, the argument here is that the public accounting of the emails is known, that there was a lead up of intelligence about Russia doing this, then it was done. And then since that time, there's been a wide variety of, yes, anonymous sources, but in different outlets saying that this was Russia and it had certain political goals. Would you say, though, all of that adds up to circumstantially strong evidence as a general matter?
No. What circumstantial evidence can you point to, Ari? You just identified what agents have claimed, what agencies have claimed, agencies that have a long history of error, that are designed to disseminate disinformation, that are subject to groupthink, that are political actors who have constantly disseminated claims that turned out to be false for whatever their motives might be. You have taken all of those agencies and you just described in your question to me what they claim. What evidence is there, definitive, circumstantial, or otherwise, that they have presented that suggests that the Russian government is behind these leaks? There is none. What is the evidence?
Right. No, I mean, I'm asking you the question. I think the background is what they predicted and then the fact that the emails were released. But
he was asking you the question, Glenn, and there was nothing leading about the question. Of course, Ari Melber went on to totally ignore everything you just said for the better part of the last decade and cover Russiagate with a lot of the hysteria that characterized MSNBC like 24/7 for, again, the better part of a decade. So, Glenn, I have to ask, tell us a little bit about, I mean, my memory is that you were like regularly on MSNBC during Bush-Obama years, or during Obama years in particular. Is it true that you've actually never been invited back, or you haven't been back on since that?
I used to be on all those shows frequently.
Yeah.
And that was the last time I had ever been asked to go on MSNBC. And I remember that interview, Emily, created a lot of anger and rage among MSNBC viewers because Russiagate was their religion. They didn't allow anyone on MSNBC to question it, to challenge it, to call it into question or dispute it. And looking back on that, like when I actually found that, I haven't seen that in many years, I wasn't even saying anything definitive. All I was saying was like, hey, as journalists, like I thought we should have learned the lesson that when the CIA leaks claims to the Washington Post and New York Times, we shouldn't put our blind faith and trust in it to believe it. We should actually demand evidence before we see it. Haven't we seen a lot of examples that prove the necessity? It was just like, hey, I think journalistic skepticism still applies, even though we all hate Donald Trump so much. Like, we're not going to renounce that. And you would have thought I was saying, like, give Vladimir Putin the Nobel Peace Prize the way, like that audience reacted. And the amazing thing about it is, I probably have said the same thing on MSNBC 100 times previously in criticizing the media on other stories. And of course, every liberal was so receptive to it because that was the story of what the New York Times and the New Yorker and the Atlantic did when it came to WMD. And that was what the New York Times apologized for. Like, hey, we can't just get anonymous leaks from the CIA and put them on our front page as though they're true unless we have evidence for it. And we didn't. And we're sorry. Sorry about that little war that killed a million people. And I don't know. I was so mystified. On top of which, if I could just say quickly, I remember the very first time Russiagate emerged. It was in mid-2016. It was in the form of this Hillary Clinton campaign ad, which was like very sinister music and that like baritone voice, like raising questions and doubts. And they were like, what do Donald Trump and the Kremlin have going on in secret? I was just like, this is the McCarthyite script. Like, it's like you just went to the basement of the CIA. There's like old crusty papers there. Probably like the corners of the paper are like crumbly. And you got that script and you're like, hey, it's been a long time. It's been like 70 years. Probably nobody remembers this anymore. And I was like, the Russians and Trump, why would the Russians need Trump and the Trump campaign to hack into? But it never made any sense. It was just journalistically so fraudulent. And I always thought it was so dangerous to blame everything wrong in our country on Russia, because there is a history of great antagonism between what is still the two largest nuclear powers on the planet. So I just, from the beginning, never saw any evidence of it. And, there are people still today who believe that Trump colluded with Russia, even though Robert Mueller, the person they held up as the greatest prosecutor ever, closed his investigation without charging anybody with that core conspiracy theory, and said in his report he could find no evidence to establish that crime. But people just still believe it like a religious doctrine.
And not an insignificant chunk of the public either. I mean, polling over the years has shown that. So I was actually just reading over the weekend Hubris, which is a book by Michael Isikoff and David Korn about the lead up to the Iraq War and how the intelligence was trumped up and sold to Judith Miller and others in the press. And it occurs to me, the most obvious point in the world, both of them bought Russiagate hook, line, and sinker, which is fascinating, and were active participants in selling it to the public. So I just have to ask, as somebody on the left, I was thinking about this, Glenn. This was used very obviously by Republican elites who originally funded the Steele dossier and Democratic elites to distract from populism and to not deal with populism. What did Democrats talk about after Donald Trump won the Republican nomination? Basically Russia for 5 years. And they never wanted to compete on the playing field of kitchen table issues with Donald Trump. They thought this was sort of their shortcut. So is it, or am I putting frustrations into sort of people on the left like yourself? Because I just have to imagine it's maddening to look back the last decade and realize that so many people, David Korn is taking propaganda from the actual intelligence community deep state and allowing that. We know this would have been, it was applied to Bernie Sanders. This is just crazy stuff that I can't believe how disinterested, even now, the left is in the story.
Michael Isikoff and David Korn, as you kind of implied, were not just supporters of the Russiagate narrative. They were the leading media figures. It was David Korn who first wrote cryptically about the Steele dossier, trying to get everybody, he was like, there's this document circulating that everyone watching the scene that's extremely incriminating of Trump and his blackmail that Russia, he's the one who introduced the Steele dossier into the ether. And Michael Isikoff pushed it as well. To Michael Isikoff's credit, about 2 years later, he actually went on MSNBC and said, we got Russiagate wrong, and it's time to acknowledge that and admit it. David Korn, to this day, it's like he has his whole identity staked in it. But, this was always so amazing to me is, so the real theme here was not just that Trump and the Russians colluded, but that Putin had sexual, financial, and personal blackmail over Trump, including a urine video with prostitutes in the Ritz-Carlton. This insane stuff was all made up and they purposely leaked it. And people believed it for a long time. So the idea was that basically Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin have taken over the United States through Donald Trump, who's their controlled, blackmailed asset. And the two main policies that the Trump administration adopted toward Russia in the first administration were, number one, they flooded Ukraine with offensive arms, something Obama refused to do. They flooded all of Ukraine with very serious, sophisticated weapons, obviously to threaten the Russians. And then the second thing Trump did was he was obsessed with destroying Nord Stream 2, the pipeline that was the center of Russia's future economic prosperity that would enable them to sell cheap economic gas to Germany and the rest of Europe. He was threatening Europe and saying, we pay for your defense. If you keep buying natural gas from Russia, we're going to cut you off. You have to buy it from us. He was frontally attacking the two most vital Russian interests in the most direct and violent way possible. Everyone in the media at that point should have been like, oh, well, he's obviously not blackmailed by Putin because he wouldn't be flooding Ukraine with offensive arms right on the border of Russia, or trying to destroy Nord Stream 2, the centerpiece of Russian economic prosperity. So it was such madness. Everybody had completely lost sense of their faculties. And I think what you're saying is so true, which is that originally the Fusion GPS was hired by the Washington Free Beacon, which is funded by Paul Singer, the billionaire neocon and corporatist, who wanted to keep the Republican Party as Jeb Bush and Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan, and he hated Trump. And then it was, the Hillary Clinton campaign that took over that research and then found the Steele dossier. And it's absolutely true that the Republican establishment used Russiagate as much as the Democrats did, in part to get everybody riled up over Russia. Hillary Clinton hated Russia for a long time. She was critical. The only thing she was critical of Obama about was that he didn't confront Russia enough in Syria and Ukraine. She wanted like antagonism toward Russia. This is the perfect story for both the Democrat and Republican warmongering establishment, not only to keep people, revved up about Russia as our great enemy, even though they're, like an economy barely the size of Italy, but also, as you say, to make sure Americans weren't focused on the populist themes that Donald Trump had so successfully convinced them to believe in, like deconstructing corporate power in in favor of the American worker, trade policies, globalism, and the military industrial complex and the deep state. Those were things none of them wanted to talk about. They wanted to make sure none of that was discussed. And Russiagate was the perfect distraction for both parties.
Yeah. And again, like David Corn of Mother Jones, it's all so pathetic looking back. But before we let you go, Glenn, speaking of actual distractions that elite class used to stop dealing with populism, I don't think it's any coincidence whatsoever that when we look back and say, I guess, do we have to call it woke? But like peak woke, capital P, capital W happened was in the middle of the last 10 years. So about halfway into the modern Trump era. And we've been talking about Russia, but we've neglected arguably the much
more important matter.
Yeah, I think you know what I'm getting at, and that's Sydney Sweeney. So American Eagle has released a statement, F5, we can put it on the screen. Sydney Sweeney has great genes, is and always was about the genes. Her genes, her story will continue to celebrate how everyone wears their AE genes with confidence their way. Great genes look good on everyone. I think it's sort of obvious, maybe you'll disagree with me on this point, but I think it's sort of obvious that American Eagle probably would have apologized or something if this had been 2018, 19, or 2020, but don't you think so?
Their executives would have committed suicide on television to apologize and to repent for their crimes against they're in support of white supremacy.
But even that wouldn't have been enough.
No, they would no, absolutely not. Obviously this is not a big issue in one sense. And what is irritating about it is that unlike in 2020 or 2018 with the excesses of Me Too and wokeism and the Black Lives Matter movement, where Democratic Party officials were all on board with that, this is coming from leftist, anonymous, losers who are 20 years old on TikTok. This is not actually
your biggest fans,
that
Glenn.
The Democratic Party. Yeah, exactly. They all have me blocked, so I don't have to actually see them. But it's the idea that this is the Democratic Party telling people that it's not, you're a Nazi if you find Sydney Sweeney pretty. This is all too political warfare, just exaggerating it. But it does seem like that discourse does feel like you've been catapulted back to the worst moments of 2020. You just thought you escaped it. And then this zombie discourse, where was it? It was molding in the corner or something, very light sleeper. And then there's Sydney Sweeney comes out, this blonde woman with blue eyes, even though she's not actually naturally blonde, talking about her genes and just a play on the words. It's documented. To have this discourse and then Donald Trump weighed on it today. Everyone's
we have this
about the Epstein files. Yeah, go ahead, show this.
This is F6, Glenn. I don't think even you could do this justice because Donald Trump posted on Truth Social today. Sydney Sweeney, a registered Republican, has the all caps hottest ad out there. He says the jeans are flying off the shelves. Go get them, Sydney. And then he goes into how Jaguar did a woke ad and ends the post by saying, of course, this is his signature sign-off. Thank you for your attention to this matter. I would say it's about 100 words on Truth Social dedicated to Sydney Sweeney, Glenn. So I feel liberated.
First of all, when I was a lawyer, I would write really mean long letters. You'll be surprised to know, and I would always end it with "Thank you, your attention to this matter." So I feel like Trump stole that. I used to love that. It is such a perfect way to end especially vicious commentary. But what's so funny is it was just 3 weeks ago when Donald Trump got asked by a journalist in the White House, "Hey, can you let us know if Jeffrey Epstein had ties to any foreign intelligence or domestic intelligence agency?" And Trump was like, "You're talking about Epstein, some weird, obscure freak? Why is this important? Why does this warrant our attention? We have so many important things to come on." And 3 weeks later, he posts some catty, bitchy commentary on Taylor Swift and Jaguar ads and Sydney Sweeney. And so it's just so funny to watch what Trump regards as important and what he doesn't. Of course, a lot of this is they know what stimulates the lizard brain of their supporters, and they know their supporters are kind of disoriented, disenchanted, and this kind of stuff is designed to get them revved up. It's so kind of obvious, I think.
Well, we promised that Glenn Greenwald would be cutting edge. We promised that he would be, what was the other thing? I don't even remember what I said. I know international is one of them.
Fun, party-like.
Yep. Oh, fearless. Cutting edge, fearless, and international. And I think, Glenn, you've checked off all of those boxes for us this evening. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you, Emily. Great to see you.
Appreciate it. All right. That was a blast. Such a blast. We have, like I said, we have guests that I've been looking forward to for a long time, and Glenn was certainly one of them. After this quick ad, we're going to have FCC Commissioner Brendan Carr join us. I pre-taped this interview earlier today because people who are in positions of great import, they probably do need to get to bed by 10, so that's okay. In the government, we'll see. I don't know. Maybe we can tempt a couple of them to come on actually after the party. But as you know, that means I'm going to be in the YouTube chat anytime we have to pre-tape. That means I'm in the YouTube chat. So if you're watching this live, I'm about to jump into the chat. But before I do, want to let everybody know that it's actually pretty hard to go to sleep after wrapping up these shows at 11 p.m. Obviously, sometimes we go to 11:20, 11:25. I don't know. Maybe today we'll even go later because this is a media interview with Chairman Carr. But broadcasting gets your adrenaline pumping like nothing else. Live television, live broadcasting, it just gets you going. But I really do mean this. Cozy Earth's bamboo sheets and bubble cuddle blanket, they make it easy, much, 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 much easier to just crash after the show. Like I said, I really mean this. It makes it like something I look forward to get into the bed and unwind after doing the show, even with all my adrenaline pumping, even after we're making all of this international news with Ellen DeGeneres, and, great guests are here like Glenn Greenwald, consequential journalists like Glenn. It actually is really hard to go to bed, but I look forward to it because I don't know. I love having a cozy bed. So I love having Cozy Earth sheets. These bamboo sheets are next level, buttery soft, breathable, and they keep you cool all night. You'll sleep a few degrees cooler, which is awesome, especially here in the swamp, and wake up genuinely refreshed. And the bubble cuddle blanket is like a warm, luxurious hug, mid-weight plush faux fur, equal parts nap-worthy and stylish. Of course, there's a reason Cozy Earth offers a 100-night sleep trial and a 10-year warranty. It really speaks for itself. They know that you will fall in love. So here's the move. Go to CozyEarth.com and use my code Emily for up to 40% off. Amazing. I couldn't even get the word Emily in my kindergarten class because there were 5 of us. So it was always Emily J. So what an honor to have the code Emily over at CozyEarth.com. That is CozyEarth.com, code Emily. And if you get the post-purchase survey, be sure to mention that you heard about it right here, because your bed shouldn't just be a place to sleep. It should be your happy place. And Cozy Earth, of course, makes that possible. As promised, I'm about to refill my wine glass, maybe turn the air conditioner on in here, and I will for sure be in the YouTube chat. But without further ado, this is our after party interview with FCC Chairman Brendan Carr. Enjoy. We're joined now by FCC Chairman Brendan Carr. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, good to be with you. Thanks so much for having me.
Of course, it's a busy time over at the FCC, and that's why I actually kind of want to start by digging into your broader project as commissioner. So the right has, for a long time, decried media bias, but in recent history, the right hasn't talked too much about whether individual stations are violating the public interest element of broadcast licensing. And that's really interesting because you came in here on the heels of the last 10 years. Media trust is tied for a record low again. And you're starting to talk, for example, this was you responding to the axing of Stephen Colbert and The Late Show by saying, quote, broadcasters, they have a federal license and they are obligated to operate in the public interest. And to the extent that we're starting to see some changes, I think that's a good thing. So I kind of just want to start with the basics here, like even technically and historically. What does it mean that the FCC allocates broadcast licensing? And how are you thinking about the question of public interest?
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to this conversation, in part because we are seeing right now some real seismic changes and shifts in the media landscape. And just to level set, there's a couple different types of sort of speakers that are out there. So obviously you have your podcast, you've got people that speak on X, formerly Twitter, you've got cable channels, but then you've got broadcast TV and radio. And broadcast TV and radio is in a category unto itself, different from all those other mediums for a couple of reasons. But one is because they're licensed by the FCC and they're required by federal law to operate in the public interest. And again, cable channels aren't licensed by the FCC, although I do get a lot of tweets about whether it's Fox News or MSNBC or CNN. We don't license them, but we do license broadcast radio, broadcast TV. Then even within that broadcast space, I think you got to draw a quick distinction. On the one hand, you have what are called national programmers. These are like ABC, CBS, NBC. They also own some TV stations, but in the main, they're the ones that produce all the programming that is then aired over broadcast TV stations. And in the majority of cases, those broadcast TV stations are owned by entirely different entities. And so you've got two different types of players in the broadcast space. And what we're trying to do as a policy matter at the FCC is to empower the owners of the actual licensed TV stations to feel like they have the freedom to serve the interests of their local communities. Because for too long, the FCC has stepped back from enforcing the public interest mandate. The results sort of speak for themselves. These national programmers, based on executives that live usually in New York or Hollywood, are creating this content that's then getting pushed down and out through the local broadcasters. And I don't think the FCC has done the industry or the American public any favors by not enforcing the public interest mandate. So that's what we're focused on. And it comes at a very interesting shifting time in the media landscape as a general matter.
So this is really interesting because back in 2020, when big tech was censoring conservatives, you were an absolute leader in that space of free speech, and you're getting criticized now. I saw this Dispatch article pulling quotes that said, in 2020, you said a newsroom's decision about what stories to cover and how to frame them should be beyond the reach of any government official, criticized the injection of partisan politics into our licensing process, said the FCC is operating as the nation's speech police by saying if ever there were a time for a federal agency to show restraint when it comes to the regulation of political speech and to ensure that it is operating within the statutorily defined bounds of its authority, now would be that time. What's interesting about what you just said with all of that is it sounds to me like you see using the public interest actually as a free speech issue in and of itself and not mutually exclusive with what you've said in the past, despite what your critics are saying now. So is that the case? Are these two in the same vein about free speech at the end of the day from your perspective?
Yeah, these are entirely consistent. So those remarks that you referred to, the context there was Democrats in Congress who were writing letters to cable companies like Comcast and urging them to drop cable channels like Fox News, OAN, and Newsmax based on the political viewpoints of the newsrooms. And again, cable channels are fundamentally different than broadcast channels. So broadcast TV stations have this obligation to operate in the public interest. And I very firmly believe that we need to have more speech, more diversity of opinion. Obviously, that's sacrosanct on the internet, on social media. I think that's a good thing. When it comes to broadcasters, though, there is that obligation to be in the public interest. And one of the things that's interesting is if you look, for instance, at CBS. So CBS recently had a transaction before the FCC. They're being purchased by Skydance. One of the things that the new purchasers said in the FCC record was if this transaction goes through, they're going to commit to a greater connection with fact-based journalism, with objective reporting, and with what they described as diversity of viewpoints across the political and ideological spectrum. And I think that's such welcome news. And frankly, it's not just a regulatory thing. I do think it's something that the marketplace is demanding. Again, just look at Colbert. We can talk more about that. But I think that's a sign of where the marketplace is changing dramatically right now.
Yeah, so you don't believe that it encroaches on free speech to say if you are a broadcast network, the public interest should mean that you are broadcasting kind of across the political spectrum and the mainstream spectrum, and you're doing your best to be fair and balanced, as people say. If you are licensed to operate in the public interest, it's not an encroachment on free speech so much as it is, so much as it is about that umbrella definition of the public interest. That has to be, again, like as somebody who comes from years of free speech activism, essentially. Like that has to be, from your perspective, something you're thinking about balancing all of the time.
Yeah, there is something just fundamentally different about a broadcast license. Because again, when the government says you get to use these 6 megahertz of airwaves, we're necessarily denying other speakers the ability to use those 6 megahertz of airwaves for their own political viewpoints. That's why the government imposes a mandate that is different than a cable channel, different than a podcast. And how the FCC has defined the public interest in the broadcast space over the years is a couple ways. One, they say you need to be responsive to the needs of your local communities. They talk about diversity of viewpoints. And so they would talk about competition as well. So there's lots of features of the public interest standard. And I do think that it's incumbent on broadcasters to meet that, and frankly, incumbent on the FCC to reinvigorate our enforcement. And if broadcasters don't like it, if they don't want a public interest obligation, that's fine. The FCC's address is 45 L Street. They can take their federal license, they can put it in the mail, and they can become a cable channel, or they become a podcast. That's perfectly fine. But if you want the benefit of using this public resource, a scarce public resource, you got to hold up your end of the bargain. And again, that's why I was glad to see CBS make some commitments in that direction. And hopefully we'll see a course correction across the board as well.
And maybe one even that benefits the left, too, because there are a lot of people on the populist left who feel shut out of the kind of mainstream discourse. They have their own issues with the elite Democrats, for example, who were involved in basically trying to get Bernie Sanders, as we now know, to be defeated by Hillary Clinton in 2016 and to shut him out of the race in 2020. So I guess, Chairman Carr, there's an argument perhaps that this isn't just beneficial to the right, that it could also probably be helpful to the populist left in some circumstances as well.
Yeah, I think that's right. Again, it's principally a particular set of executives. Again, they're mostly in New York, mostly in Hollywood, and it's been their viewpoint or their lack of diversity of viewpoint that has been the predominant factor in media over the last couple of years. And look, there is a real sort of crisis taking place in the legacy mainstream media right now. I mean, just look at the number of stories over the last 4 or 5 years where there's just been massive misses and consistent misses across all of these different legacy outlets, whether it's Russiagate, whether it was the Russian bounties in the Middle East, whether it was if you remember sort of the whips at the border, or the Jussie Smollett, mostly peaceful protests, Covington Catholic. I mean, something has gone seriously awry that these significant major stories, the Hunter Biden laptop story, President Biden's mental acuity, just were all missed. And so I do think there's definitely a need for a course correction. I think in the main, it happens from the market. But again, I don't think you can overlook the role that President Trump is playing here. And he's playing a very important role where I think President Trump is fundamentally reshaping the media landscape, but not necessarily in the ways or that a lot of people think about it. I think what he's done is he's helped facilitate a much broader macro movement. So for instance, when President Trump ran for election, he ran directly at the legacy mainstream media, and he smashed through the facade that, again, these executives in New York and Hollywood get to control the narrative. They get to decide what everyday people think and are allowed to say. And he was really speaking up for American people who simply don't trust the mainstream media anymore. And once they lost that gatekeeper status, there's a lot of different consequences that flow from that. Again, I think that broader trend is why you see Colbert show ending and them struggling, and other shows similarly. But I think it goes back to President Trump, because most politicians, they just simply accepted the narrative that the mainstream media dictated, and they felt constrained to operate within the terms that they set. And President Trump upended that. And again, if you look at all of the changes that are taking place already since President Trump has won the election in terms of the reshaping the media landscape, it's pretty impressive. You got PBS defunded, you've got NPR defunded, you've got Colbert show ending, you've got Joy Reid out at MSNBC, Lester Holt out at NBC, you've got Terry Moran gone at ABC, you've got these new owners of CBS committing to more fact-based, objective reporting. ABC reached a settlement with Trump, CBS reached a settlement with Trump. You got Washington Post, Jeff Bezos, committing their editorial board to a different approach on their editorials and people quitting because they didn't want to run patriotic op-eds over there. So I do think that there's a fundamental shift taking place. I think you do have to look at Trump as part of the reason for that. But again, in a much bigger macro picture way, it's not, sort of the nefarious picking up the phone and, bullying people that some of the reporters want to sort of attribute it to. And again, I think the reason why they look at that is they don't want to grasp or deal with that much bigger picture changes that's taking place in media right now.
Yeah, because that's where this gets into a lot of the media criticism, and actually probably criticism from some folks on the Hill as well. Definitely some criticism from some folks on the Hill as well, because there's what you're doing at the FCC, and it's not happening in a vacuum, because it's also happening with what Donald Trump is doing, sort of with the bully pulpit and Truth Social and his various statements about his own different political enemies. So, Chairman, I wanted to get you to respond to the rendition of all of this, because you just mentioned the sort of picking up the phone and making those kind of backroom deals or whatever. I wanted to get you to respond to this rendition. Speaking of cable being different than broadcast networks, on South Park, and see what we can talk about on the other side of it. We can go ahead and roll the South Park clip.
Break bread with me. This is my body, given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. Now just eat the bread and listen. I didn't want to come back and be in the school, but I had to because it was part of a lawsuit and the agreement with Paramount.
The president's suing you?
The guy can do whatever he wants now that someone back down, okay? Eat the bread, eat the bread. You guys saw what happened to CBS? Yeah, well, guess who owns CBS? Paramount. You really want to end up like Colbert? You guys gotta stop being stupid.
We can't understand you.
Just shut up or we're going to get canceled, you idiots.
Tom, they're calling it the Sermon on the Mount.
Okay, Chairman. So is that protected speech? And what is that rendering of how this is all going down, getting right or wrong from your perspective?
Yeah, I think everyone's trying to look for the tree, and they're missing the forest, right? Of that broader trend line of, once President Trump ran the legacy national media and he sort of removed their gatekeeper status. Once you had social media like X embrace free speech, people had access to news and information. And so, running just a partisan carnival, I think the way the Colbert Show was, is simply just not very good business. And satire is awesome, right? Satire is probably one of the most fundamental and early aspects of free speech in all of democracy. And people should feel free to make fun of people that are in positions of power, whether it's the president or myself. I mean, trust me, I get my fair share of ribbing. I'm not doing my job until I get made fun of more in some of these shows. I mean, it reminds me, there was a former FCC chairman, Newt Minow, who talked about broadcast TV at the time being what he gave this famous speech that described it as the vast wasteland, and broadcasters didn't like it. And that's why you saw sort of the SS Minnow was the famous ship on Gilligan's Island, was named after an FCC chairman. So that's the mark that I need to try to at least hit or exceed. But I think also, when you look at comedy, you look at these late night shows, again, satire is great. We want it, make fun of everybody. I think it's part of what makes for democracy. But a lot of these late night shows went from, there's an op-ed that described this, that they basically went from being court jesters, making fun of everybody, to court clerics, where instead of going for laugh lines, they were going for applause lines. And they were trying to enforce a particular political orthodoxy. And not that there's anything wrong with that, but it turns out that that's not necessarily a great business model. And reports are that the Colbert Show was losing something like $50 million a year. And you can only sustain that for so long. And so, again, I think people want to look for the tree. They want to look for something, specific and nefarious, because they are whistling past the graveyard of these bigger macro shifts that are taking place in media. And yes, I think those bigger macro shifts have to do with President Trump, but not for the reasons that people think. It's because he hasn't played the game of allowing the legacy mainstream media to set the narrative.
Yeah, there's a lot of speculation about nefariousness potentially behind the scenes of the Paramount Skydance merger, which actually required your approval at the FCC, cleared that hurdle last week. Do you believe that CBS axed Colbert and The Late Show in any way to win your favor, to win Donald Trump's favor in the merger process?
No, I don't think so at all. I mean, look, the FCC's own review process here, we ran our normal course standard process. We had a full commission vote. All the commissioners, there's 3 of us, 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, voted. There was people that were expressing concern that we weren't going to have a commission level vote on the item. We did. We ran our normal process there. In terms of the amount of time that it took and the timing of the review itself, it was right in the sweet spot of how long it takes the agency, both now and the prior administration, to review deals like this. And so these things were all, as I said many, many times, unrelated. There was that private lawsuit that was settled. There was a news distortion complaint that continues to be pending at the FCC. And then there was the transaction itself. And we just ran our normal process on it.
Was from your perspective, The Late Show operating in the public interest? And did you have any prior conversations with them about whether they were operating in the public interest with that show with Colbert? I mean, they're still on and they're still doing their thing. So did any of that go on?
No, I mean, there's no discussions from my part about the Colbert Show at all. I mean, I learned about it the way everyone else learned about it, or I guess most everybody learned about it, which was on news reports. It wasn't part of the FCC's review or transaction one way or the other.
And is there, like, as we think about public interest and, one thing we talk about on the show all the time is the Johnny Carson model versus the Colbert model. And both of them respectively were top in late night, which is a remarkable reflection on some of the macro trends you've just been talking about.
One was top in making money and one was top in losing money.
Yes. So although it's remarkable that Colbert, I think, was able to be top in ratings, and that's with a much lower number that Colbert than Johnny Carson was, because you're just competing for a smaller slice of the public, because the scarcity that meant you were allocating licenses to them in the past has basically evaporated with different technology. I mean, it still exists, obviously, with broadcast licenses, but it's different with all of the other technology. So if Colbert is doing a broadly anti-Trump show, does that mean CBS is not operating in the public interest?
Well, the one interesting question is, Congress has created special rules for equal opportunity, equal time, for instance. And the FCC has said, actually statutorily, that those particular rules don't apply to a bona fide news program. And at least historically, there were some late night shows where the FCC would say that sort of couch sit down interview portion was itself a bona fide newscast and therefore exempt from the congressional political rules, meaning if you were in the relevant period of time before an election, you could have one candidate on and not the other. We haven't looked at those rules in a long time, but it strikes me that a lot has changed since the FCC first started saying that those couch sit-downs are bona fide news programs. And it would seem to me that before the FCC would provide any such exemption to any of these late shows, I think they should come back into the FCC and re-up any requests, because it's not clear to me that they would qualify as bona fide news programs. But again, the obligation isn't on CBS itself as a national programmer. The obligation, the public interest obligation, is on the local TV station. So for instance, if they don't feel like the programs that they're getting from CBS Central meet the needs of their communities or further the public interest, then they should have the right, and they're supposed to in their agreements, to preempt the programming and do something else. In fact, a week or so ago, I started a new inquiry into Comcast, which owns NBC, and I've asked to get copies of their agreements with the local TV stations to try to make sure that there's not terms or conditions in that relationship between, again, national programmer and the actual TV station that is precluding the TV station from fulfilling its public interest obligations. So, those are sort of a cluster of issues that we need to look at.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about that. We can put this up on the screen because I'm reading from a Variety report as of last week that you informed Comcast on Tuesday you're launching an investigation of the company's relations with NBC affiliates. And they write, days after President Trump called for the network to be held, quote unquote, accountable for favoring the Dem Party and threatened to revoke broadcast licenses, the FCC has an interest in and the authority to promote the public interest and to ensure that local broadcast TV stations retain the economic and operational independence necessary to meet their public interest obligations, is your point. And so I basically want to ask in this case, do you see your deregulatory agenda as actually complementary to course correcting or helping the media course correct to being more aligned with that perspective on public interest?
Yeah, I think so. Again, fundamentally, our North Star in the media portion of the FCC's docket, and there's other stuff that we do. In fact, we have a whole Build America agenda that we're running that looks at spectrum and infrastructure and workforce issue. But within the media space in particular, my North Star is I want to find ways to empower those local broadcast TV stations, the ones that are actually licensed by the FCC, and they're owned by a range of different companies, Nexstar, Gray, Sinclair, to empower those stations to feel like they can serve the needs of their communities and to some extent to shrink the power of the national programmers like CBS, NBC, ABC. And so by looking at NBC and the contractual relationships they have with the local stations, it's consistent with that broader goal that we're trying to push in the media ecosystem.
And to the point that Variety sort of combined these two things, noting that you sent Comcast that letter after Donald Trump called for NBC to be held accountable. That doesn't that doesn't strike you as inappropriate? I mean, I'm guessing because you're involved in it, but it's not inappropriate from your perspective to have the president criticizing the networks, pressuring the networks for different coverage, and then acting with that letter from your part.
Yeah, no, not at all. I mean, I've sent a number of letters at this point to lots of the entities that we regulate, whether it's Comcast. I've sent letters and inquiries to Disney, which runs ABC. Of course, we've done issues with Verizon as well. We're working with a lot of different companies across these regulated spheres, and I want to move them all in a direction that promotes the public interest, whether it's, a company like Verizon, where they've agreed to end their DEI, their invidious forms of DEI discrimination. I think that's a good thing. Disney, ABC, I'm looking similarly at some DEI issues there, whether it's Comcast looking at this network affiliation relationship. I mean, there's going to be a lot of activity. The FCC's busy place. There's going to be a lot of activity between the FCC and regulated entities. And President Trump is also, very focused on media issues as a general matter from his public feed. You can see that. And so I do think, we're both going to be speaking on similar issues at similar times. But I think that's going to continue because that's where our focus is.
Yeah, and we have this from The Verge as well. The Freedom of Press Foundation filed a complaint against you with the Office of Disciplinary Counsel at the D.C. Court of Appeals, alleging that you had repeatedly broken basic principles of conduct as a licensed attorney, including by leveraging your power to control media outlet speech. But The Verge, in their coverage of this letter, even admits, as a legal complaint, quote, it's a long shot, but the filing accuses you of perpetuating a quote-unquote unconstitutional shakedown. Now, I know you don't agree with that characterization, but I think this was just filed today. So what's your response, Mr. Chairman, to this complaint that was filed here in D.C.?
Well, look, it's obviously a totally frivolous filing that's simply trying to intimidate the FCC and stop us from doing our job. And I can assure you that that is not going to happen. If anything, we're going to continue to accelerate our work. We've got an obligation from Congress to enforce a public interest mandate on broadcasters. And, that's exactly what we're going to do. And we're going to, keep at it as long as we have the privilege of serving this job. I'm not worried about that filing. It was an attempt, I think, to get a headline, and maybe they got one in The Verge. But beyond that, it has no meaning to me.
Okay, so just returning as we wrap up here to that question of scarcity. I'm a millennial. It's weird for me. I can't imagine what it's like for Gen Z and people, Gen Alpha next up, who don't know, as you said, who Juicy Smollett even is, Mr. Chairman, to think about anything in the media world as being scarce because there's just so much technological capacity for competition now. So I wanted to ask you a little bit what your own media diet looks like. What are you consuming? Are you deep in the podcast world? How do you think about these things based on your own consumption of different media on your own?
Yeah, I've definitely shifted a lot into podcasts. I mean, really, it sort of accelerated during COVID-19. I sort of kept the habit up. But yours is a good one, so we've got to keep that in the mix as well. But I listen
good answer.
A lot of Ruthless, a lot of All In podcasts. Try to take in a variety of different things. But you're right. I mean, this idea of scarcity and broadcast, which has justified historically the licensing of these stations, may seem odd to people. But at the same time, it's a decision that Congress made, and it's up to the FCC to enforce it. If people don't like it, again, they can go to Congress and they can say, we don't think it makes sense anymore to treat broadcasters different, given all the competition that's out there. But until that happens, we got to enforce the law. And I do think that there's some changes we should do in the media space in light of podcasts and all this competition, because if you look at local TV stations, for instance, they're competing really in the market for advertising dollars. And if you look at sort of the percentage of advertising dollars that had supported local TV stations that has swung to digital, whether it's Google or Facebook, it's a dramatic number. And we saw this first with newspapers, right? We've got hundreds and hundreds of newspapers that have shuttered all across the country. And to some extent, that's the ghost of Christmas future for local TV stations if the FCC doesn't update its approach so that those local stations can compete with Google, with Facebook in the market for advertising. Because I do think there's still something very important in this country to have local news, local reporters, local journalists. And to some extent, that's unique among the broadcast TV, because podcasts and cable channels, they're really good at the national stories. But it's those local reporters at local TV stations that cover the local stories. And so I do think, again, empowering those to continue to do well, to survive, to stay in business is part of what the FCC does, even if it does pinch some of those national programmers a little bit.
And last question, as I think about this as someone on the right and, broadly supportive of the idea that competition generally makes a better product, I look at all this competition. I look at, how Colbert, I think, made that show, drove that show into the ground from my perspective, because he was going for a narrow slice that was more and more loyal of the public. And that's how you end up with, I think his average is probably 2.5, 3 million, somewhere like that. But still losing money for the network. So anyway, all that is to say, is this competition making any of those outlets right now better, or is that trend sort of yet to be seen from your perspective?
I do think that the competition is helping. I do think that the market forces are encouraging right now. Again, if you just sort of run your program the way CBS had allowed the Colbert show to be run, they're losing money. And so I do think you're seeing a market course correction there, which is needed. But a lot of the stuff you see across the board, frankly, with NPR and PBS as well, with Congress passing laws to defund them, really they only have themselves to blame. For years, it wasn't that long ago, that NPR and PBS, their viewership was a pretty good cross-section of the American electorate as a general matter. When you're basically forcing the American people to have money taken out of their pocketbooks to support something, I think it makes sense that you would attempt to be broadly appealable. But as a former editor at NPR, Uri Berliner, that put out a lot of op-eds on this, said, in his view, NPR just increasingly tried to appeal to a narrower and narrower base of basically, Acela corridor listeners. And then, that bargain with the American people of forcing them to subsidize it no longer made sense. And so I do think across the board, obviously there was some government action there, but we are seeing some market forces and some course corrections. I think that's a good thing. It's definitely needed.
Chairman Brendan Carr, thank you so much for your time tonight.
Yeah, good to be with you. Thanks.
Okay, so a couple of interesting takeaways there. Obviously, the chairman said that he did not have any communication with CBS or Paramount about Colbert. He said he found out about the decision from the news media, just like everyone else did, which is quite interesting. Also very interested in his point that if the broader public doesn't like him suddenly leveraging that definition of public interest, then Congress perhaps should act about whether or not the public interest definition still should apply to broadcast networks in basically a media atmosphere that nobody could imagine would exist when I think it was actually the Federal Communications Act, the piece of legislation that established that, was originally passed. Now, I will say, you think there's an interesting, I don't know if interesting is the right word. I still think having the president weighing in on these media outlets and their broadcast licenses, while also having the FCC chairman do that. As a journalist, which is the worst 3 words that you can say, maybe after as a millennial. My God, I'm a millennial journalist. I'm having an identity crisis on the air right now. But there are certain people in the industry who will make decisions based on that. I'm not saying that I have any examples of that happening right now, because I don't know that that's the case. But it also wouldn't shock me if we learn that later down the line that was what was happening behind closed doors. So not ideal, but also the media's status quo is so egregious and offensive that I frankly have a hard time getting worked up about any of it. So we thank Chairman Carr for joining us here on After Party. And now for an ad that I tell you with all sincerity, I have been so excited to read for weeks because it's Masa chips. I got a box of these to my front door. I didn't know what they were. I tried them and I was blown away. Let me tell you, I love chips. I love chips with a sandwich. It is one of my very favorite meals. I am not a foodie, nothing fancy or gourmet. Usually that's, it's simply too sophisticated for my unsophisticated palate. I enjoy simple things. And one simple thing that I enjoy is a sandwich with chips. But chips now are so disgusting that when I tried these Masa chips, looked on the back and saw the ingredient list, it honestly blew my mind. So I've been very excited to do this ad. All chips and fries used to be cooked in tallow up until the 1990s. You've all probably heard that many times by now, when big corporations switched to cheap processed seed oils. Today, seed oils make up 20% of the average American's daily calories. Recent studies have linked seed oils to metabolic health issues and inflammation. Go to YouTube and look up those videos of canola oil being made. They will ruin your appetite. But Masa did something about it. They created a delicious tortilla chip with just 3 ingredients and no seed oils: organic nixtamalized corn, sea salt, and 100% grass-fed beef tallow. And you can taste the beef tallow, and it is absolutely fantastic. It is such a wonderful taste. These chips avoid all the bad stuff. They taste incredible. Masa is crunchier, tastier, and it doesn't break in your guac. Snacking on Masa chips is nothing like eating regular chips. With Masa, you feel satisfied and light with no crash or bloat afterwards. Is honestly so true. The beef tallow makes the chips satiating, so you won't find yourself uncontrollably binging. Also true. And feeling hungry afterwards. Masa chips is beloved by thousands of customers and has been endorsed by industry-leading health and nutrition experts. So if you're ready to give Masa a try, go to masachips.com/afterparty and use code afterparty for 25% off your first order. That's masachips.com/afterparty and code afterparty for 25% off your first order. Those things are delicious, believe me. And now a word on South Park. Just because we were talking about it with Chairman Carr, I have to say, I've never been a South Park person. I know some women are. I do think, honestly, that it's a sex thing. South Park is so male-coded to me. Every time I watch it, I guess I see the appeal, but it's never been my thing, so it's probably not surprising to people. Like, cartoons aren't my thing, but I actually have always also thought that American Dad and Family Guy are funnier than South Park, and cueing a lot of angry commenters here, including some of my friends, but that is just my perspective on it. Even that said, nobody is, other than like the MAGA right, saying this about the South Park episodes on Trump so far. I know we were talking about Sydney Sweeney earlier, but I feel like for South Park, which I'm not even a huge fan of, this satire has been mid. I feel like South Park can do better than what they've done with Trump. It feels like, honestly, I'm sorry, but it feels like sort of brain dead 2017, like MSNBC lib nonsense. It has not made me laugh that hard, and I'm willing to laugh at this. So far be it from me, a humble podcaster, but I feel like South Park it feels like they're doing so much low-hanging fruit, and that's kind of their thing sometimes. Like, if you're the best person at picking the low-hanging fruit, that there's a virtue to that. But I actually feel like they can do better. So that was that's been sort of stuck in my craw for a couple of weeks now, because there's so much hype about how hilarious these South Park segments are. Like, there is really funny anti-Trump satire, and I just thought that was mid. I feel like it was mediocre. Like, it really could be better. So, moving on from that, maybe this will be a more popular take, but I wanted to roll this clip of a position of agreement I found with Michelle Obama. Maybe unexpected to everyone, but I thought this was actually quite an interesting comment from the former First Lady. So let's take a listen.
If I listen to ESPN for an hour, it's like watching the Real Housewives of Atlanta.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's the same drama, and they're yelling at each other, and they don't get along. I mean, Stephen A. Smith, he's just like every other
he'd
talk
be a
show
great
host.
Real Housewife.
He would be,
Right.
right?
It would be amazing.
So that's why I'm like, what's the difference? It's just, it's just sociological drama. If I listen to ESPN for an hour,
so
it's like
let me
watching
just
the real.
share this tab instead, because guess what? I actually wrote a story very similar to this for the Federalist in 2019. So if anything, Michelle Obama, maybe she read it. That seems slightly unlikely to me. But I actually think this is a really interesting point. And at the same time, I think it's somewhat undignified, correct me if I'm wrong, undignified, first of all, for the former First Lady of the United States to have a podcast. I say that as a podcaster. For the former First Lady of the United States to have a podcast, which she does with her brother, and obviously she had her husband on recently, it just feels undignified. It feels like it is below, especially because it's not like some type of special podcast. It's them sitting around in t-shirts and jeans and talking about the Real Housewives. And I'm saying this again as somebody who is a podcaster and agrees with Michelle Obama on this very important take. This was the headline of my Federalist story all the way back in 2019, which was assigned to me, so I can't take full credit. But if Real Housewives fought physically instead of verbally, it'd be WrestleMania. I watched all of WrestleMania, and this brilliant nugget occurred to me about halfway through it, and I think it's completely true. And there's something about the emotional dynamics of the Housewives. So if you're watching the Housewives as a woman, the primary poll is the emotional dynamics of the group. If you are watching football as a man, it's not that the emotional dynamics are irrelevant, but you are primarily pulled in by the physical dynamics of the competition. And to me, that's such a perfect distillation, oddly enough, of the male and female brain, that for women, here you have this utterly low risk, with a couple of exceptions, but this utterly low risk arena for emotional warfare. And for men, in the case of sports, you have this relatively low risk, it's not literal war, arena for physical dynamics, physical competition. So the Housewives are emotional competition, and don't get me started. I don't think that this necessarily applies to The Bachelor. I've always said the Housewives are far superior to The Bachelor. If you want to watch real reality TV, give up on The Bachelor, go to The Real Housewives, start with season 4 of The Real Housewives of New York City. That would be my recommendation, or start at the beginning of Vanderpump Rules and just clear a weekend. Don't move off the couch. Get a cooler for water, electrolytes. That's how you should handle whichever weekend you're able to book out for it. But I thought it was somewhat interesting after all of the sort of gender fluid mania of the last 10 years to have Michelle Obama, I think, making a shockingly salient point here, dare I say, about the actually really, I think, fair illustration that we see in both of these things. And actually, Jerry O'Connell had a great show on Bravo for men at one point that I think made this very clear, because it was sort of ironic and funny that the men were also pulled in to the emotional dynamics of the Housewives and of Bravo. That was like genuinely the shtick of the show, is that it's funny that the men are getting pulled into this. I don't think, again, I think emotions are an important part of sports too, but I also think that the primary, let's say, appeal of both genres really clearly illustrates where we're coming from as men and women, and to hear it from Michelle Obama herself, the former First Lady herself. I'm not going to go in any further into exploring that particular thread or any jokes that may come of it. But Michelle Obama, I think you were correct about the Real Housewives. Finally, before we wrap tonight, I just wanted to share a couple of thoughts. I did watch the new Happy Gilmore. I was a little disappointed. I mean, it was basically what I expected. I love the original Happy Gilmore. That was a VHS tape that my friends and I just wore out at sleepovers back in the day. So I thought that it was totally worth watching, like a really fun time. Could have maybe been funnier. You know who's great in it though was Travis Kelce, and Bad Bunny was really good in it too. So it was a delightful watch. It doesn't, of course, live up to the original. Nothing really ever does. But worth a watch. Could have been better. Still really fun. More importantly, I watched the live action Lilo and Stitch last night, and I'm curious. I don't watch a lot of kids movies, so I'm curious if any of the parents have a reaction to this. But man, translating that from animation to live action, I think absolutely upped the emotional resonance of the plot in a way that was borderline sadistic. I was a wreck. I was sobbing. I was losing my mind at the live action Lilo and Stitch because it was all gas, no brakes on the emotional low notes and the pains. This is not a spoiler at all. I mean, the original Lilo and Stitch, which this is very true to, has been out for a long time. So all I'm saying is that they twist the knife over and over again in a way that feels it feels cruel when you're watching the live action version. The actress who played Lilo was brilliant. Of course, the actor who played Stitch was brilliant. Actually, I don't know how they did Stitch. I assume like combination of CGI. I don't know, but it was great. It was just, honestly, I thought borderline cruel for a children's movie to keep twisting the knife. But actually, probably a lot of that goes over kids' heads because I don't remember it pulling at my heartstrings quite as much when I was a kid either. So maybe it's when they really, really get the adults. Many such cases, as the president would say. My email address, by the way, is emily@devilmaycaremedia.com, emily@devilmaycaremedia.com. Feel free to send your thoughts over there. I try to respond to every email as best I can. We will be back here on Wednesday, 10 p.m. live. Maybe we'll have more updates on the international saga of Ellen DeGeneres and whether or not she was cruel to her staff when she had a talk show back in the day. So stay tuned. Maybe we'll have updates. Maybe we won't. I shouldn't promise anything, but I will promise more fun. So 10 p.m. Wednesday, we'll be back.